My arrogant boss fired me in the middle of a massive hazardous transfer, calling me a worthless pump jockey. He thought tossing me off his pristine estate would be the end of it. But he forgot who was operating the master valve. I made one call, left the pressure running, and unleashed a 12,000-gallon flood that washed away his multi-million-dollar empire forever. Chapter 1. The Graveyard Shift. At 11:30 p.m., on a damp, unforgiving Tuesday in late October, the industrial yards of the county were swallowed by a thick, freezing fog, the kind of fog that clings to your high-visibility jacket and makes the massive floodlights overhead look like hazy, glowing halos. I stood next to my rig, a beautifully maintained 60-foot Peterbilt tanker, holding 12,000 gallons of highly concentrated, industrial-grade liquid fertilizer. My name is James Murray. I am in my mid-40s, and for the last 2 decades, I have made my living hauling hazardous materials, corrosive chemicals, and commercial agricultural liquids across state lines. It is a job that requires absolute precision, endless patience, and an unwavering respect for the destructive power of the fluid sloshing around in the stainless steel belly of the trailer. The air tasted of raw ammonia, wet asphalt, and the sharp bite of impending winter. I was currently parked not at our usual commercial distribution depot, but on the sprawling, manicured edge of a massive private estate. This property, spanning 50 acres of rolling hills and freshly laid topsoil, belonged to Brad Owens, the owner of Owens Liquid Logistics, my boss. Brad had recently purchased the land with plans to flip it to a high-rolling commercial real estate developer named Mr. Harrison. Before the developer arrived for a final walkthrough later in the week, Brad wanted the entire estate hydro-seeded and aggressively fertilized using company resources. It was highly unethical, entirely off the books, and a logistical nightmare. But when you work for a man like Brad Owens, you either follow his whims or you find yourself standing in the unemployment line. I checked the heavy canvas hoses connecting the tanker to the estate's massive underground irrigation reservoir. The heavy rubber was rigid under the immense pressure of the transfer pump. I reached out with my heavy leather gloves, feeling the steady or rhythmic vibration of the fluid rushing through the line. The 400-horsepower Cummins diesel engine of my truck idled with a low, reliable rumble, powering the PTO, the power takeoff, that drove the massive pump. Every gauge on my control panel was perfectly in the green. Pressure was steady at 45 psi. Temperature was stable. I clicked the heavy radio strapped to my shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Murray here. Do you read me?" "Mike?" Static crackled for a moment before the anxious, sleep-deprived voice of our young night dispatcher echoed through the speaker. "I read you, James. How's the pressure looking out there? The boss called me twice already asking if the transfer is done. He's breathing down my neck, man." "Tell Brad he needs to learn patience," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "I'm pushing 12,000 gallons of dense agricultural nitrogen into a residential-grade reservoir. If I open the throttle any wider, I'll blow the main seal on the underground tank and send a geyser of fertilizer straight through his new marble patio. We do this by the book, or we don't do it at all." "I know, James, I know," Mike sighed, the sound of tapping keyboards faintly audible in the background. "It's just, you know how he gets. He's hosting Mr. Harrison tomorrow afternoon. He wants the trucks gone and the ground saturated before the sun comes up." "I copy," I said, leaning against the cold metal of the tanker. Logging the time at 11:45 p.m., we are at 20% capacity transferred. I'll check in at the halfway mark. Murray out. I lowered the radio and took a deep breath of the cold air. Being in my 40s meant I didn't have the luxury of bouncing from job to job anymore. I had a mortgage, utility bills, and a family relying on the steady paycheck and the health insurance this job provided. I took pride in my work. I was the guy the company called when the loads were dangerous, when the weather was treacherous, and when the margin for error was absolutely zero. I knew the safety protocols like the back of my hand, not because the company mandated them, but because I had seen firsthand what happens when people cut corners. Brad Owens, however, was a man who lived his entire life cutting corners. He had inherited the logistics company from his father, also a hard-working man who had built the fleet from a single truck. Brad had never driven a rig, never coupled a high-pressure hose, and never had to clean up a toxic spill at 3 in the morning. He viewed his drivers as necessary evils, replaceable cogs in a machine designed exclusively to fund his lavish lifestyle, his expensive sports cars, and his sprawling real estate ventures. I walked the length of the hose again, a flashlight tight in my grip, illuminating the damp grass. The connection at the reservoir intake was holding strong, clamped tight by heavy steel brackets. The sound of the liquid rushing into the dark abyss of the underground tank was a steady, hollow roar. I knew that the process would take at least another 3 hours at this safe, controlled pace. I climbed up into the warm cab of my truck, poured myself a cup of black coffee from my battered silver thermos, and settled into the driver's seat to monitor the digital gauges. Outside, the fog continued to thicken, wrapping the extravagant estate in a blanket of blinding white. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the engine, completely masking the storm that was about to hit. Chapter 2. Pump Jockeys Are Worthless. At exactly 1:30 a.m., the peaceful rhythm of the transfer was shattered by the blinding glare of high-beam LED headlights slicing through the fog. A sleek midnight blue sports car came tearing up the freshly paved driveway of the estate, its tires kicking up a spray of wet gravel. It slammed to a halt just inches from the front bumper of my Peterbilt. The driver's side door flew open, and out stepped Brad Owens. Even in the dead of night, Brad looked like he was heading to a country club luncheon. He wore a tailored wool overcoat that cost more than my monthly salary, perfectly pressed trousers, and designer leather shoes that had no business being anywhere near an industrial work zone. His face was flushed, his jaw set in a tight, angry line, and the distinct smell of expensive bourbon trailed behind him as he marched toward my rig. I immediately set my coffee down, stepped out of the cab, and met him near the pump controls. "Evening, Mr. Owens," I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "We're sitting at roughly 45% transferred. Everything is holding steady." 45%? Brad snapped, his voice echoing sharply against the metal of the tanker. He aggressively tapped his gold wristwatch. "It is nearly 2 in the morning, Murray. I told dispatch I wanted this rig off my property by midnight. What the hell is taking so long?" "The underground intake pipe is only a 4-inch diameter, sir," I explained calmly, pointing a gloved finger toward the heavy hose. "If I increase the output pressure on the main valve, the back pressure will rupture the coupling. We are dealing with highly concentrated nitrogen fertilizer. A blowout here wouldn't just stain the grass, it would create an environmental hazard." "Environmental hazard? Give me a break," Brad scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. He stepped dangerously close to the exposed, spinning PTO shaft without a second thought. "It's glorified dirt food, Murray. I have Mr. Harrison arriving here at noon to sign a multi-million-dollar purchase agreement for this land. I can't have my estate looking like a truck stop, because my driver is too scared to turn a knob. Open the valve all the way, now." "With all due respect, Mr. Owens, I cannot do that," I replied, planting my feet firmly. "Safety protocol dictates a maximum flow rate of—" "I don't care about the damn protocols," Brad shouted, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He reached out and aggressively shoved my shoulder. "I own this company. I own that truck. I own the ground you are standing on. John, you don't tell me what you can and cannot do. You turn that valve to the maximum right now, or you're done." I stared at him, feeling the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my composure. I reached up and keyed the microphone on my shoulder. "Dispatch Unit 4. Mike, are you on the line?" "I'm here, James." Mike's voice crackled, clearly hesitant. "Mike, I want this recorded on the main operating log," I said clearly. "Mr. And Owens is on site and has ordered me to bypass the safety pressure limits on a hazardous liquid transfer. I am officially refusing the order due to imminent risk of catastrophic equipment as failure and environmental contamination." Brad stared at me in absolute disbelief, his mouth slightly open. For a few seconds, the only sound was the deep hum of the diesel engine and the rushing liquid. Then, Brad exploded. "You insolent, arrogant old fool!" he screamed, stepping into my personal space. "You think you can embarrass me on my own radio network? You think your little safety rules mean anything in the real world? Let me tell you something, Murray. You pump jockeys are worthless. You are entirely replaceable. I can find 10 guys tomorrow who will turn that valve without whining." "They might turn it," I said quietly, "but they won't be able to stop the spill when the line blows." "Get off my property!" Brad hissed, his eyes narrowed with pure malice. "Excuse me?" I asked, wanting him to clarify. "You heard me. You are fired, terminated, as of right this very second," Brad roared, waving his hand toward the main road. "Get away from my truck. Get off my land. Leave the keys in the cab and walk your worthless self down to the highway. I'll finish this transfer myself. I want you gone. Now." "Mr. Owens," I started, gesturing to the heavy master valve that was currently holding back thousands of gallons of pressurized liquid. "The pump is actively running. I need to sequence the shutdown." "Did I stutter?" Brad interrupted, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. "Do not touch my equipment. If you lay one finger on that control panel, I will have you arrested for tampering with private property. Walk away, Murray. Walk away right now, or I'm calling the police for trespassing." I stood perfectly still for a moment, the cold wind whipping around us. I looked at the master valve. It was currently locked in the open position, and it was steadily pushing the fertilizer out. I looked at Brad, his face twisted in a sneer of arrogant triumph. He really believed he had won. He really believed that firing a man in his 40s in the middle of a frozen night was a demonstration of absolute power. He had explicitly ordered me not to touch the equipment. He had officially terminated my employment. I nodded slowly. I reached up, keyed my radio one last time. "Mike, did you copy all of that?" Yeah, James." "Nick, I heard it all," Mike whispered, sounding terrified. "Log the time," I said. 2:15 a.m. My employment has been officially terminated. I have been explicitly ordered to abandon the active pumping station and to not touch any company controls. I am complying with the owner's direct orders. I unclipped the radio from my shoulder and gently placed it on the steel step of the cab. I looked Brad dead in the eye, offering him a polite, chilling smile. "Have a good night, mister." Then Owens. Chapter 3. The Open Valve. I turned my back on Brad Owens, the massive Peterbilt, and the 12,000 gallons of liquid fertilizer. I zipped my high-visibility jacket up to my chin, grabbed my battered silver thermos from the hood of the truck, and began the long walk down the winding, freshly paved driveway of the estate. The dense fog immediately swallowed me, dampening the sound of the idling diesel engine, but I could still hear the powerful, rhythmic thumping of the transfer pump, doing exactly what it was designed to do: push liquid at an unstoppable rate. As my heavy steel-toed boots crunched against the wet gravel, a strange sense of calm washed over me. Any normal man in his 40s who had just been fired on the spot would be panicking. They would be worrying about the mortgage, the bills, the lack of health insurance. And truthfully, a small part of my brain was already doing the math. But a much larger, more experienced part of my brain knew exactly what I had just walked away from, and exactly what Brad Owens had unwittingly unleashed. Brad was a man who wore expensive suits and signed checks. He didn't know the first thing about fluid dynamics. He didn't know that the underground reservoir he was filling only had a capacity of roughly 5,000 gallons. He didn't know that the automated shutoff float inside that reservoir had been notoriously sticky for months. A maintenance ticket I had filed 3 separate times, only for Brad to cancel it to save a few dollars. Most importantly, Brad didn't know how to disengage the massive power takeoff clutch on the Peterbilt without stalling the entire engine and potentially creating a vacuum lock in the pressurized lines. He had explicitly ordered me, with a witness on a recorded company radio line, not to touch the controls. He had forbidden me from initiating the complex shutdown sequence. I reached the massive iron gates at the entrance of the estate just as a local patrol cruiser slowly rolled past, its headlights cutting through the gloom. I waved my flashlight, and the cruiser pulled over. The window rolled down to reveal Officer Freeman, a local cop I recognized from the neighborhood diners. He was a good man, steady and observant. "James, what are you doing walking out here in the freezing fog at 2 a.m?" Officer Freeman asked, leaning over the center console, a look of genuine concern on his face. "Evening, officer," I said, leaning casually against the wet roof of his cruiser. "I've just been terminated by the owner of Owens Liquid Logistics, Brad Owens. He's up at the main house." Officer Freeman raised an eyebrow. "Fired? Out here? Do you need a ride home?" "A ride to the nearest diner would be much appreciated," I nodded. "But before we go, I need to make an official report, officer. I need you to document something for me right now." Freeman grabbed a heavy notepad from his dashboard and clicked his pen. "Go ahead, James. What's going on?" I was in the middle of a high-pressure hazardous materials transfer, I stated, making sure my voice was loud and clear. Mr. Owens arrived, ordered me to halt my safety protocols, and fired me when I refused. He explicitly commanded me to walk away from the equipment while the main pressure valve was fully open. He threatened to have me arrested if I touched the shutdown controls. Officer Freeman's pen paused on the paper. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "Wait, you left the main valve open? How much liquid is in that tanker?" "There are currently about 10,000 gallons of concentrated industrial fertilizer, actively pumping into a tank that can only hold 5, I explained calmly. I warned him. I logged it with dispatch. But I am no longer an employee, and I was threatened with trespassing. I am legally notifying law enforcement of a potential environmental incident caused by the property owner. Officer Freeman quickly jotted down my exact words, noting the time as 2:45 a.m. Then he looked toward the foggy hill where the estate sat hidden in the dark. "Do you think he knows how to turn it off?" "Brad Owens doesn't know how to change a tire on a golf cart," I replied, taking a sip of my black coffee. "By my estimation, that underground reservoir is going to breach capacity in exactly 20 minutes. When it does, the back pressure will force the liquid straight up through the ventilation grates. And if he tries to force the master valve shut without cutting the engine RPMs first..." I didn't need to finish the sentence. Officer Freeman nodded grimly. "Get in, James. Let's get you a warm cup of diner coffee. I'll make sure this report is filed with the county dispatcher immediately." I slid into the warm passenger seat of the cruiser. As we drove away from the estate, leaving the foggy hills behind, I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard, 2:50 a.m. Brad Owens had roughly 15 minutes before his multi-million-dollar dream was utterly submerged. I leaned back against the headrest, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace. I had followed his orders perfectly. I was just a worthless pump jockey, after all. And a worthless pump jockey wouldn't dare lay a finger on the boss's equipment. Chapter 4. A Call to an Old Friend. At 3:15 a.m., the neon sign of Hank's 24-hour diner buzzed with a frantic, that flickering hum that seemed perfectly tuned to the anxiety trying to claw its way into my chest. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth across from Officer Freeman, the warmth of the thick ceramic coffee mug radiating into my cold, stiff hands. The diner smelled heavily of stale frying oil, harsh industrial floor cleaner, and old coffee. Normally, this smell was comforting, a staple of the late-night trucker's world, but tonight, my stomach was churning. I took a slow and deliberate sip of the bitter black liquid and stared out the rain-streaked window into the dark parking lot. The adrenaline of the confrontation with Brad Owens was finally beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of my situation. I was a man in his late 40s, suddenly stripped of his livelihood in the middle of the night. My mind immediately went to my daughter, Sarah. She was 22, brilliant, and fiercely independent, but she battled a severe, chronic autoimmune condition. The biologic medications that kept her out of the hospital and allowed her to live a normal life cost roughly $4,000 a month out of pocket. Without the comprehensive health insurance provided by my employment at Owens Liquid Logistics, that financial burden would fall entirely on my savings, which were already stretched thin by my mortgage. Brad Owens knew this. He knew about Sarah's condition because I had requested specific schedule adjustments for her medical appointments over the years. That was the leverage he thought he held over me. He firmly believed that because my family depended on his company's benefits, I would swallow my pride, ignore my safety training, and blindly follow his dangerous orders just to keep my paycheck. He thought I was trapped. He was incredibly wrong. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy, high-visibility jacket and pulled out my smartphone. I scrolled past the missed calls from our terrified night dispatcher, Mike, and navigated to a contact I hadn't dialed in nearly 5 years. The name on the screen simply read, Lieutenant Reynolds. Lieutenant Cora Reynolds was a hard-nosed, razor-sharp commanding officer within the State Environmental Police, specifically running the Hazardous Materials Enforcement Division. Half a decade ago, before Brad inherited the company, at Owens Liquid Logistics had a contract moving waste for a massive, shadowy chemical manufacturing plant down south. I had stumbled upon a hidden manifest detailing thousands of gallons of toxic runoff being illegally dumped into municipal storm drains to avoid processing fees. I knew if I went to my supervisors, the paperwork would vanish, and I would be quietly fired. Instead, I made an anonymous, highly detailed phone call to Cora Reynolds. I provided her with the exact routing numbers, the dates, and the off-the-record drop locations. That information allowed her division to execute a massive, multi-agency raid that shattered the illegal dumping ring, resulted in dozens of federal indictments, and earned Cora her promotion to lieutenant. We had met in person only once, in a quiet parking lot weeks after the bust, where she looked me in the eye and told me that if I ever needed a favor, a real favor, I only had to call. She called it a life debt. I called it doing the right thing. Tonight, I was calling in that debt. I tapped the screen and held the phone to my ear. It rang 4 times before a groggy but instantly alert voice answered. "Reynolds." "Lieutenant," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so as not to disturb the few other patrons in the diner. "It's James Murray. I apologize for the late hour." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of rustling sheets. When she spoke again, all traces of sleep were gone. Her voice was sharp and focused. "James, it has been a long time. You don't call at 3 in the morning unless the sky is falling. What's the situation?" "The sky isn't falling, but the ground is definitely about to be flooded," I replied, leaning forward against the sticky laminate table. "I need to report an imminent, massive environmental hazard, and I need you to dispatch your primary enforcement team to a specific residential location first thing this morning. No local jurisdiction, Cora. This needs the state's full authority." "Give me the details," Cora instructed, the sound of a pen clicking open echoing through the speaker. "The location is the private estate of Brad Owens, the current owner of Owens Liquid Logistics. It's the new 50-acre property out on County Route 9, I explained, methodically laying out the facts. At approximately 1:30 a.m., I was ordered to pump 12,000 gallons of highly concentrated, commercial-grade liquid agricultural fertilizer into an unrated, unvented residential underground reservoir. The tank only holds roughly 5,000 gallons. When I refused to bypass the safety pressure limits, Mr. Owens officially terminated my employment, ordered me to abandon the active pumping station, and threatened me with trespassing if I touched the shutdown controls. "He ordered you to leave a pressurized system running unattended?" Cora asked, her tone shifting from professional to utterly incredulous. "With thousands of gallons of concentrated nitrogen?" "I have it entirely documented on the official company dispatch radio logs," I confirmed, glancing up at Officer Freeman, who gave me a solemn nod of support. Officer Freeman of the local precinct has already filed my official police report confirming the timeline. Brad Owens currently has a wide-open master valve pushing liquid at 45 psi into a system that is going to catastrophically breach any minute now. By sunrise, that entire estate is going to be saturated in toxic, caustic sludge. It will run off into the local water table if it isn't contained. "That absolute fool," Cora muttered, all the scratch of her pen moving rapidly across paper. "He just engineered his own environmental disaster. A spill of that magnitude on unzoned residential soil? That's an immediate Level 2 hazmat response, James. I can freeze his assets, lock down the property, and initiate a full state investigation." "That is exactly what I'm counting on, Lieutenant," I said, a grim sense of satisfaction finally settling into my bones. He thought I was just a worthless pump jockey he could throw away. I need you to show him exactly what a worthless pump jockey is capable of when they follow the rules. "Consider it done, James," Cora promised, her voice laced with steel. "My team will be rolling out by 6 a.m. Stay close. I have a feeling I'm going to need your official witness statement on the record." Chapter 5. The 12,000-gallon morning. At 6:30 a.m., the freezing fog that had choked the county all night finally began to lift, surrendering to the pale, gray light of early dawn. Officer Freeman had generously offered to drive me back to the perimeter of Brad Owens' sprawling estate so I could retrieve my personal pickup truck, which I had left parked near the main gates before my shift began. As we cruised down County Route 9, the windows of the police cruiser were rolled up tight against the cold, but long before the massive wrought iron gates came into view, the smell hit us. It was an overpowering, eye-watering stench, a thick, suffocating wave of raw ammonia, concentrated sulfur, and rotting organic matter. It smelled like a massive chemical fire mixed with a stagnant swamp. Officer Freeman visibly gagged, quickly reaching down to slam the cruiser's air conditioning system into the recirculation mode. "Good heavens, James!" Freeman choked out, his eyes watering as he gripped the steering wheel. "Is that the fertilizer?" "That's commercial-grade liquid nitrogen compound," I nodded grimly, staring out the windshield. "Ah, it is designed to be diluted at a ratio of 100 to 1 before it ever touches topsoil. Straight out of the tanker, it is highly caustic, incredibly heavy, and completely unforgiving." We pulled up to the main entrance of the estate. I stepped out of the cruiser and walked over to the heavy iron bars of the gate, looking up the long, winding driveway toward the main house. The sheer scale of the devastation was breathtaking. And Brad Owen's multi-million-dollar dream had been entirely swallowed by a nightmare of his own making. The underground reservoir had catastrophically failed exactly as I knew it would. Unable to handle the immense back pressure of the active pump, the heavy steel ventilation grates had been blown completely off their concrete hinges, thrown several yards across the manicured lawns. From that ruptured opening, thousands upon thousands of gallons of thick, dark brown, old foaming liquid had erupted like a toxic geyser. The fertilizer had cascaded down the gentle rolling hills of the property like a mudslide. The pristine, emerald green lawns were gone, replaced by a smoking, blackened wasteland, where the concentrated nitrogen had literally chemically burned the grass down to the roots. The custom-built, multi-tiered retaining walls had acted like dams, pooling the foul-smelling liquid until it overflowed, pouring a dark waterfall of sludge directly into the newly installed, Olympic-sized sunken tennis courts, transforming them into a toxic brown swimming pool. The white marble of the expansive outdoor patio was deeply permanently stained a sickly yellow-brown, the caustic chemicals eating away at the expensive stone finish. And standing right in the middle of the ruined driveway, wearing a pair of hastily donned rubber boots and a silk bathrobe, was Brad Owens. He looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive disaster. The sleek midnight blue sports car he had driven so aggressively the night before was now sitting axle-deep in a thick puddle of foaming agricultural waste. My 60-foot Peterbilt tanker sat silently near the reservoir, its massive engine finally stalled out. Once the tank had emptied its 12,000-gallon payload, the massive pump had sucked in pure air, in creating a vacuum lock that choked the diesel engine to a halt, but not before every single drop of cargo had been forcefully expelled onto the estate. Brad was frantically pacing back and forth on the ruined marble patio, a smartphone pressed desperately against his ear. He was screaming, his face purple with rage and panic, though the distance muffled his exact words. When he turned and saw me standing calmly at the main gates, observing the absolute destruction of his property, as his eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated fury. He dropped his phone into his pocket and began trudging down the driveway toward the gates, the thick sludge sucking at his rubber boots with every furious step. It took him a full 5 minutes to navigate the ruined, slippery landscape. By the time he reached the other side of the iron bars, he was breathing heavily, his pristine silk robe splattered with dark, foul-smelling mud. "You!" Brad screamed, or his voice cracking hysterically as he gripped the iron bars. "You did this! You sabotaged my equipment! You destroyed my property! I am going to sue you for every penny you will ever make in your miserable life, Murray! I am going to ruin you!" I stood perfectly still, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my jacket. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a calm, practiced indifference. "I didn't do a single thing, Mr. Owens," I stated clearly, my voice carrying easily over the morning breeze. "You explicitly ordered me to walk away from an active, pressurized hazardous materials transfer. You threatened to have me arrested for trespassing if I touched the shutdown sequence. You fired me, and I complied with your direct orders to the letter. You left the master valve open, sir, not me." "You knew this would happen," Brad shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. "You knew the tank would overflow. Just you did this on purpose. I warned you," I corrected him calmly, pulling my smartphone from my pocket and tapping the screen. I hit play on a saved audio file. The terrified voice of Mike, our night dispatcher, echoed from the small speaker, followed perfectly by my own voice, logging the exact time, the exact conditions, and Brad's exact refusal to allow me to engage the safety protocols. The recorded threat of termination and trespassing rang out crystal clear in the cold morning air. Brad's face drained of color. The furious purple rage was instantly replaced by a stark, sickening realization. He stared at the phone in my hand as if it were a loaded weapon. He knew, in that exact moment, that he had no scapegoat. He had no one to blame. He had legally, verifiably, and completely orchestrated the destruction of his own estate. "Mr. Harrison is arriving at noon," Brad whispered, his voice trembling as he looked back at the smoking, ruined acreage. "He's supposed to sign the land purchase agreement today. If he sees this, the deal is dead. The company needs that capital, Murray. You have to help me clean this up. I'll rehire you. I'll double your salary." "I'm afraid I don't work for you anymore, Brad," I said, turning my back on him and walking toward my pickup truck. "And unfortunately for you, a broom and a garden hose aren't going to fix this. That you're going to need a lot more help than I can provide." Chapter 6. The Lieutenant Arrives. By 9 a.m., the quiet rural stretch of County Route 9 had been completely transformed into a chaotic staging ground. The thick, noxious odor of the spilled fertilizer still hung heavily in the air, but the silence of the morning had been entirely replaced by the relentless, authoritative hum of government intervention. I sat on the tailgate of my pickup truck, sipping a fresh coffee I had grabbed from a nearby gas station, and watched the spectacle unfold with a deep, quiet satisfaction. A convoy of 6 gleaming white SUVs, each proudly displaying the vibrant green seal of the State Environmental Police, had aggressively descended upon the estate. They were accompanied by 2 heavy-duty incident command trucks and a massive mobile laboratory unit. Yellow hazardous materials caution tape had already been strung up across the wrought iron gates, more effectively sealing off the entire 50-acre property from the outside world. Men and women in heavy-duty protective suits and respirators were systematically moving across the ruined landscape, carrying clipboards, digital cameras, and sophisticated chemical atmospheric sensors. Standing at the epicenter of this highly organized chaos, looking utterly immaculate in her crisp, dark green uniform and polished boots, was Lieutenant Cora Reynolds. She was a woman who commanded respect without ever needing to raise her voice. Her posture was rigid, her expression entirely unreadable behind a pair of dark aviator sunglasses, and she held a thick metal clipboard like a shield. Brad Owens was currently trapped in her orbit, and he was completely unraveling. He had finally managed to change out of his mud-splattered silk robe and was now wearing a designer suit. All but the expensive fabric did nothing to hide the sheer panic radiating from his entire body. He was pacing frantically around Cora, waving his arms and pointing desperately at my abandoned Peterbilt tanker. "Listen to me, Lieutenant. You are entirely overreacting," Brad pleaded, his voice carrying clearly down to where I sat. "This is a simple private landscaping accident, a faulty valve on the truck. My private cleanup crew will be here in an hour with vacuum trucks. We will have this pumped out and power washed before lunch. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to barricade my private property." Cora slowly lowered her clipboard, looking at Brad over the rim of her sunglasses. "Mr. Owens, you are currently standing in the middle of a 12,000-gallon, uncontained hazardous chemical spill. This liquid nitrogen compound is highly toxic to local flora and fauna. Furthermore, this estate sits less than a quarter mile from the county's primary underground drinking water aquifer. The moment this chemical breached your underground reservoir and made contact with unzoned, unlined residential soil, it ceased to be a private landscaping accident and became a Level 2 state environmental emergency." "I know the mayor," Brad blustered, trying to puff out his chest in a pathetic display of authority. "I play golf with the county commissioner. If you do not remove this caution tape and get your people off my land right now, I will have your badge by the end of the day." Cora didn't even blink. "You are welcome to call the mayor, Mr. Owens. You are welcome to call the governor. However, under Section 402 of the State Clean Water Act, I am officially freezing all assets related to this property. This land cannot be sold, transferred, or developed until my division completes a comprehensive, multi-phase environmental impact assessment. Your cleanup crews are forbidden from entering this site. If they attempt to remove a single drop of this soil without my explicit authorization, they will be arrested and you will be charged with tampering with a federal investigation. Brad stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The reality of his situation was finally crushing him. The multi-million-dollar land sale to Mr. Harrison, the commercial developer, was entirely dead. The property was locked down. The financial ruin was absolute, but as I watched the scene, I knew the worst was yet to come. Cora turned away from Brad and signaled to a team of technicians standing near the mobile laboratory. "All right, let's get moving. The surface saturation is severe, but I need to know the percolation rate. Bring out the heavy augers. We are initiating deep soil core sampling immediately. I want columns pulled from 10, 20, and 30 feet down across the entire northern quadrant of the property." The moment Cora said the words, "deep soil core sampling," a profound, visceral change washed over Brad Owens. From my vantage point on the tailgate, I saw it happen in slow motion. Brad didn't just look angry or panicked anymore. He looked utterly, genuinely terrified. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His knees visibly buckled, and forcing him to grab onto the side of one of the white SUVs just to stay standing. He stared at the heavy motorized drilling equipment being unloaded from the state trucks with eyes wide with raw, primal horror. "No," Brad whispered, his voice shaking so violently I could barely hear it. He stumbled forward, reaching a trembling hand out toward Cora. "No, please. You don't need to dig. The spill is right here on the surface. Please, Lieutenant, I'll pay whatever the fine is. I'll sign whatever you want. Just clean the surface. Do not dig into that ground." Cora narrowed her eyes, instantly sensing the massive shift in his demeanor. A predator recognizing the scent of fear. "The law requires deep soil analysis to ensure the aquifer is safe, Mr. Owens. Why are you so terrified of what we might find underneath your pristine lawn?" Brad couldn't answer. He just stood there, shaking, staring at the ground beneath his feet as if it were a bomb about to detonate. I took a slow sip of my coffee, a cold chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Brad's reaction wasn't about the fertilizer. The fertilizer was a surface problem. Brad Owens was terrified of what was buried underneath it. And as the heavy steel auger of the drilling rig violently pierced the ruined, chemical-soaked earth, I realized that my 12,000-gallon flood hadn't just destroyed his future. It was about to unearth his past. Chapter 7. The Developer's Retreat. By high noon, the pale gray dawn had given way to a stark, unforgiving midday sun that did nothing to improve the situation on County Route 9. In fact, the rising temperature only exacerbated the catastrophic reality of the 12,000-gallon fertilizer spill. As the sun beat down on the 50-acre estate, the thick caustic liquid nitrogen compound began to bake into the ruined soil, sending shimmering, invisible waves of foul-smelling vapor rising into the air. The stench was no longer just a heavy odor. It was a physical barrier. Even sitting 100 yards away on the tailgate of my pickup truck, I could feel the sharp, chemical bite of the ammonia burning the back of my throat. I had spent my entire adult life hauling hazardous materials, and even I found the sheer scale of the environmental devastation difficult to look at. The heavy, and a rhythmic thumping of the motorized augers echoed across the valley. Lieutenant Cora Reynolds and her team of state environmental police had wasted absolutely no time. 3 massive drilling rigs were currently positioned across the ruined, sludge-covered northern quadrant of the property, their heavy steel bits biting deeply into the earth. They were pulling continuous core samples from 10, 20, and 30 feet below the surface, or systematically mapping the potential spread of the toxic fertilizer toward the county's underground drinking water aquifer. Brad Owens was sitting on a decorative stone boulder near the barricaded wrought iron gates, completely isolated. The local police had arrived to assist with traffic control, and Officer Freeman had ensured that Brad was not allowed to leave the perimeter. Brad had completely given up on trying to command authority. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was loosened, and he sat with his head buried in his hands, staring blankly at the ruined marble patio in the distance. He looked like a man who was watching his entire empire burn to the ground in slow motion. At exactly 12:15 p.m., a massive custom-ordered silver Bentley SUV slowly rolled up to the police barricades. The vehicle was pristine, a glaring symbol of immense wealth and corporate power. It came to a smooth, or silent halt just inches from the bright yellow hazardous materials tape. The driver's side door opened, and a sharply dressed chauffeur stepped out, quickly moving to open the rear passenger door. Out stepped Mr. Harrison, the high-rolling commercial real estate developer, who was scheduled to sign a multi-million-dollar purchase agreement for the estate that very afternoon. Harrison was a tall, imposing man with silver hair, impeccably tailored clothes, all and a reputation for being entirely ruthless in his business dealings. He had planned to tear down the private estate and transform the 50 acres into a massive, state-of-the-art logistics hub. It was a deal that would have made Brad Owens incredibly wealthy and secured his company's future for decades. Harrison stood by the open door of his Bentley, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He took one deep breath of the air, and his sophisticated, neutral expression instantly shattered. He pulled a crisp white handkerchief from his breast pocket and clamped it firmly over his nose and mouth, his eyes watering furiously. He surveyed the chaotic scene before him, the fleet of state environmental police SUVs, the men in heavy hazmat suits, the massive drilling rigs, and the sprawling, blackened, smoking wasteland that used to be a pristine lawn. Brad Owens practically launched himself off the stone boulder. "Mr. Harrison, sir!" Brad shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as he sprinted awkwardly toward the barricade, his expensive leather shoes sliding dangerously in the residual mud. "Please, sir, don't leave. I can explain everything. It looks much worse than it is." Mr. Harrison did not step any closer to the barricade. He kept his handkerchief firmly pressed to his face and held up a single, perfectly manicured hand, stopping Brad in his tracks. "Mr. Owens?" Harrison's voice was muffled, but radiated a cold, uncompromising authority. "My legal team was informed by the county clerk 20 minutes ago that this entire parcel of land has been frozen under a state environmental injunction. We were told there was an incident, but I preferred to see it with my own eyes before terminating our contract." "It's just a surface spill," Brad pleaded, gripping the iron bars of the gate. His knuckles were white with tension. "A disgruntled employee sabotaged my equipment last night. The state police are overreacting. I have a private remediation team on standby. The soil will be replaced, the area will be power washed, and we can still close the deal by the end of the month. I will even drop the asking price by 20%. Please, Mr. Harrison, you know the geographical value of this location." Mr. Harrison slowly lowered his handkerchief. His eyes narrowed in absolute disgust. He looked at Brad not as a business partner, but as a liability. The geographical value of this location is completely irrelevant when the soil is glowing with toxic nitrogen, Brad, Harrison stated, his tone dripping with condescension. "My developers build commercial logistics hubs, not Superfund cleanup sites. You have state hazmat teams running deep core drills on a residential property. Even if you scrubbed every inch of this land with a toothbrush, the liability insurance alone would bankrupt my firm. Yet you are currently the subject of a massive environmental investigation. Any association with you or Owens Liquid Logistics is a public relations nightmare." "But the contract," Brad stammered, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "We shook hands. You promised me the capital infusion to expand my fleet. Our contract contained a very standard, very explicit environmental integrity clause, which you have spectacularly violated," Harrison replied, turning his back on Brad and gesturing for his chauffeur. "The deal is dead, Mr. Owens. My legal team will be sending formal notification of termination by the end of the hour. Furthermore, if you attempt to contact my offices again, I will file a restraining order. Good luck with your landscaping." Without another word, Mr. Harrison climbed back into the luxurious, climate-controlled sanctuary of his Bentley. The heavy door closed with a solid, expensive thud, its completely severing Brad Owens from his last remaining lifeline. The silver SUV smoothly executed a three-point turn and glided away down County Route 9, disappearing into the distance. Brad collapsed against the wrought iron gate, his legs finally giving out completely. He slid down to the wet asphalt, his head resting against the cold metal bars, defeated. He had tried to save a few pennies by forcing me to ignore safety protocols, and in doing so, he had instantly vaporized millions of dollars. But as I watched him weep quietly on the pavement, I noticed that the rhythmic, heavy thumping of the drilling rigs in the distance had suddenly stopped. I sat up straight on my tailgate, my eyes locking onto the northern quadrant of the property. The state technicians in the heavy hazmat suits were no longer operating the machinery. Instead, they were gathered tightly around the primary drill shaft, and their body language entirely completely shifted from routine observation to frantic urgency. One of the technicians was aggressively waving a yellow flag, signaling directly to Lieutenant Reynolds. The real nightmare had just begun. Chapter 8: The Whistleblower's Trap. The sudden heavy silence that fell over the estate was far more terrifying than the roar of the massive diesel engines. For a few tense moments, the only sound was the gentle rustling of the wind through the dead, chemically burned trees. From my vantage point outside the perimeter, I watched as Lieutenant Cora Reynolds marched briskly across the ruined lawn, her polished boots sinking into the toxic sludge with every determined step. She reached the cluster of technicians huddled around the primary drilling rig. There was a brief, animated exchange of words, and then one of the hazmat workers carefully retrieved a long, cylindrical soil sample from the heavy steel auger. Even from a distance, and I could see that something was fundamentally wrong. The top section of the core sample was the expected dark, sludge-soaked brown of the fertilizer spill, but the lower section, the soil pulled from 20 feet below the surface, was a sickly, unnatural shade of neon green and oily black. Lieutenant Reynolds leaned in, inspecting the sample closely. She then pulled a small handheld chemical sensor from her belt and waved it over the freshly excavated dirt. The device immediately began flashing violently, emitting a sharp, piercing alarm that echoed across the quiet valley. Cora snapped her head up, staring directly at the ground beneath her feet, before turning sharply and pointing a rigid finger at Brad Owens, who was still slumped against the iron gates. She keyed the heavy radio strapped to her shoulder and began issuing rapid, aggressive commands. The entire dynamic of the scene shifted instantly. This was no longer just an environmental containment operation. It had suddenly become a heavily secured crime scene. 10 minutes later, Cora ducked under the yellow caution tape and walked briskly over to my pickup truck. She pulled off her dark aviator sunglasses, and I could see a fierce, uncompromising fire burning in her eyes. She leaned against the side of the truck bed, exhaling a long, heavy breath. "You always seem to know exactly when to call me, James," she said, her voice low and tight with adrenaline. "I only called about the fertilizer, Cora," I replied, offering her a serious look. "What did your team just pull out of the ground? That alarm sounded like a structural breach." "It wasn't a breach, it was an absolute collision," Cora explained, her jaw set firmly. "My team was drilling down to test the percolation rate of the nitrogen compound. At exactly 22 feet below the surface, the primary auger hit solid steel. They had to switch to a diamond-tipped bit to push through. When they finally extracted the core, they didn't just find contaminated soil." Cora paused, looking back toward the frantic activity on the lawn. "They found a buried 55-gallon industrial steel drum, and James, the sensor didn't detect agricultural nitrogen. It detected concentrated trichloroethylene and highly degraded polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs. We just hit a massive buried cache of illegal, all highly toxic industrial solvents." I felt a cold chill wash over me, the pieces of the puzzle aggressively slamming into place. Brad's sheer primal terror when Cora had ordered the deep soil testing, his desperate begging, his frantic attempt to sell the property to a developer who would immediately pour concrete over the entire 50 acres. He didn't just buy this land to build a house, I realized, the magnitude of the crime dawning on me. He bought this remote property years ago. This was his off-the-books dumping ground. He's been burying his highly toxic commercial waste out here to avoid the federal disposal fees, and now he was trying to sell the land to Harrison to make it someone else's problem. "Exactly," Cora nodded grimly. "And if you hadn't refused that order last night, James, if you had just followed his commands and prevented that fertilizer spill, we never would have had the legal probable cause to run a deep soil environmental scan. Brad Owens would have sold this land, the concrete would have been poured, and those rusting barrels would have eventually leaked directly into the county's primary drinking water aquifer. You didn't just ruin his day, you potentially saved thousands of lives." "What happens now?" I asked, looking over at Brad. "Now, the trap snaps shut," Cora said, a dangerous, satisfied smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Because you officially reported the initial spill, you are officially classified as the primary catalyst and documented whistleblower for this entire investigation. The federal government offers a massive financial bounty for whistleblowers who expose illegal PCB dumping. I am going to make sure my report heavily highlights your direct involvement and your absolute refusal to compromise safety protocols. You are going to be a very wealthy man, James." She pushed herself off my truck, securing her sunglasses back on her face. "But right now, I have a wealthy, arrogant CEO to arrest." I sat quietly on the tailgate and watched as Lieutenant Cora Reynolds marched back over to the wrought iron gates, flanked by two heavily armed state police officers. Brad Owens didn't even try to run. He didn't scream, and he didn't threaten to call his lawyers. As Cora read him his Miranda rights, detailing the severe federal felony charges of illegal hazardous waste disposal and environmental terrorism, Brad simply stared at the ground. Like when the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, he finally looked up. His eyes met mine across the barricade. There was no rage left in him. There was only the hollow, devastating realization that his relentless greed, his absolute disregard for safety, and his arrogant belief that I was just a worthless pump jockey had perfectly orchestrated his total and absolute downfall. Officer Freeman gently placed a hand on Brad's shoulder, guiding him toward the back of a waiting police cruiser. I raised my coffee cup in a silent, final toast as the door slammed shut, sealing his fate. Chapter 9. Clear Waters. 8 months later, the freezing fog and the bitter cold of that October night felt like a lifetime away. It was a bright, beautiful afternoon in early June. I was sitting on the wide, wraparound wooden porch of my newly purchased home, a modest but beautiful property nestled on the edge of a pristine, heavily wooded state park. The air smelled of blooming honeysuckle and fresh pine, a massive welcome departure from the harsh chemical sting of raw ammonia and industrial solvents. Beside me, relaxing in a comfortable rocking chair, was my daughter, Sarah. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the exhaustion that used to permanently shadow her eyes had completely vanished. She was currently laughing. It's scrolling through pictures on her tablet of a recent hiking trip she had taken with her friends. It was a sight I had prayed to see for years, and it was a reality made possible entirely by the spectacular implosion of Owens Liquid Logistics. The aftermath of the 12,000-gallon spill had been swift, brutal, and entirely public. When the state hazmat teams fully excavated Brad Owens's property, they unearthed over 400 rusting and leaking barrels of highly toxic industrial waste that Brad had been illegally burying for the better part of a decade. The sheer scale of the environmental crime triggered a massive federal investigation by the EPA. Owens Liquid Logistics was immediately seized and liquidated by the government to help cover the astronomical costs of the multi-year soil remediation process. Brad Owens never saw the inside of a courtroom. His defense attorneys took one look at the mountain of evidence, all the audio recordings and Lieutenant Reynolds' airtight investigation, and advised him to plead guilty. He was currently serving a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, his wealth entirely stripped away to pay the massive federal fines. As for me, Lieutenant Reynolds had kept her word. Because my official documented refusal to compromise safety protocols had directly triggered the investigation, I was officially recognized as the primary whistleblower. The federal government awarded me a percentage of the fines levied against the company, a massive, life-changing six-figure bounty. It was enough to completely pay off Sarah's medical debts, secure her expensive biologic medications for the rest of her life, and allow me to comfortably retire from the grueling, dangerous world of hazardous material transport. I was no longer a pump jockey. I was simply a father who finally had the time and the resources to take care of his family,